I'd better confess that when you were inside the Klan, I was among many who had praise of Mr. Hoover and the Bureau, because they seemed to know every communist cell and half a dozen agents. And why weren't they doing the same thing about the Klan? Now, in their defense, my notion was that they would have somebody in a crowd in order to be able to report Klan violence, and as a result, prevent the violence which was occurring. I was too dumb to realize that your presence in there did not prevent violence, and indeed maybe contributed to it. This is what Senator Philip Hart of Michigan said to FBI Ku Klux Klan informant Gary Rowe when Rowe testified during the Church Committee's landmark investigations into the U.S. intelligence services. We've discussed on this program the FBI's ruthless pursuit of black activists and civil rights activists. At the same time the FBI was hounding civil rights activists as dangerous subversives, the Ku Klux Klan was engaged in a reign of terror that included lynchings, bombings, assassinations, and other acts of violence designed to not only uphold white supremacy, but prevent people from exercising their free expression rights to organize against it. So how then did the FBI's actions against the Klan compare to their actions against civil rights movements? This is Still Spying, presented by Defending Rights in Dissent, and I'm host Chip Gibbons. Later in this program, I will be joined by historian Mary Stanton to discuss the FBI's most infamous Klan informant, as well as the relationship between law enforcement and the Klan. But first, let's go into some background. The FBI is supposed to investigate violations of federal civil rights law, and the Klan, with its violent attacks on African Americans and civil rights organizers, certainly was undeniably afoul of them. Yet Hoover was a notorious racist. He viewed civil rights advocacy as evidence of communism, and he viewed being a vicious anti-communist crusader as his prime reason for existing. When 14-year-old Emmett Till was brutally lynched, it shocked the nation. Given the impossibility of finding justice in the apartheid South, many called for a federal civil rights investigation. Hoover's correspondence shows that he was not interested in the murder of Till, but in his belief that the Communist Party were behind the calls for a federal investigation. They were doing this in order to, quote-unquote, rabble-rouse. Hoover would later claim that Emmett Till, when he was brutally murdered, was not deprived of any federal rights. The FBI's handling of civil rights investigations, including that of Till, would arouse strong criticisms. When Martin Luther King allegedly asserted the FBI was too close to Southern segregationists and local law enforcement, Hoover publicly declared him the most notorious liar in the country. But the high-profile murder of civil rights activists and the Klan's reign of terror was too much to ignore forever. According to the Church Committee, in mid-1964, Justice Department officials became increasingly concerned about the spread of Ku Klux Klan activity and violence in the Deep South. Attorney General Kennedy advised President Johnson that because of the unique difficulty presented by a situation where lawless activities had the sanction of local law enforcement agencies, the FBI should apply to the Klan the same techniques used previously in the infiltration of communist groups. And I want to go back to the idea that these lawless activities had the sanction of local law enforcement. During his testimony to the Church Committee, Rowe was asked about his experiences where police officials collaborated or in some way were accomplices to violent and illegal acts. He also told the committee that they had access to the intelligence files of the Birmingham Police Department. Now, following this pressure, the FBI made a choice to move control of Klan-related operations from the General Investigation Division, which is what handled criminal investigations, to the General Intelligence Division. In other words, the FBI's efforts against the Klan ceased to be one of criminal investigation and became one of domestic intelligence. the FBI would begin a COINTELPRO operation against white hate groups, which included the Klan. Now, as you recall, COINTELPRO was a secret covert operation that had no law enforcement purpose. Instead of targeting criminal activity, they sought to neutralize disfavored speech. So how did the COINTELPRO operations against the Klan compare to the FBI's other counterintelligence programs? Well, according to Frederick A.O. Swartz, Jr., who was the lead counsel for the Church Committee, he made a number of remarks during the committee's hearings on the FBI about this. He stated the FBI's COINTELPRO against the Klan paled in comparison to the viciousness with which they targeted black organizations, and that of all the COINTELPRO operations, it was the most limited as it stuck the most closely to individuals involved in actual violence. To be clear, some of these counterintelligence operations of the Klan most certainly did involve deprivations of civil liberties, and we're not wishing they were more violent or more vicious, but it is worth noting how there is a clear double standard in how the FBI treats white supremacists who are violent versus how it treats civil rights groups that are nonviolent. But the most disturbing revelations from the Church Committee concerned Klan informant Gary Rowe. Rowe, by his own concessions, had been engaged in Klan violence, including beating up Freedom Riders while on the FBI payroll. In the case of the Freedom Riders, local police told the Klan they had 15 minutes to attack them before the police would intervene, something the FBI knew about well in advance but took no action.
You mean the Birmingham policemen set up the beating of the Freedom Riders and you told the FBI that?
That's correct, sir.
And then were they beaten?
They were beaten very badly, yes.
And did the Birmingham police give you the time that they promised to give you to perform the beating?
Yes, sir. We were promised 15 minutes with absolutely no intervention from any police officer whatsoever.
Rowe's involvement in violence, however, went much further. To this day, there involves questions about just how deeply involved in Klan violence Rowe was, including his participation in bombings and even murders. And we're going to discuss this in more detail with Mary Stanton. Now, this is history, but it has an incredible bearing on our present. The FBI still is continuously criticized for putting greater focus on nonviolent racial justice activists than it does on violent white supremacists. During a 2016 rally organized by the White Supremacist Traditionalist Workers' Party, white supremacists stabbed counter-protesters with the civil rights group By Any Means Necessary, or BAM. The FBI responded by opening up a domestic terrorist investigation into BAM. Additionally, the FBI misidentified the Traditionalist Workers' Party as the Ku Klux Klan and considered opening an investigation into BAM for conspiring to violate the rights of the Ku Klux Klan. The FBI documents, now this is 2016, described the Ku Klux Klan as a group that consisted of members that some perceived to be supportive of a white supremacist agenda. With many people now talking about how an uptick in white supremacist violence requires more powers for an agency that is best known for spying on civil rights protesters, it's worth thinking through this history and what its implications for the present are. Joining us more to talk about the FBI's informant and the Ku Klux Klan is Mary Stanton. Stanton is a noted chronicler of the left and social justice movements in the South and has taught at the University of Idaho, the College of St. Elizabeth in New Jersey, and Rutgers University. Her past works include From Selma to Sorrow, The Life and Death of Viola Liuzzo, and Journey Towards Justice, Juliet Hamilton Morgan and the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and Freedom Walk, Mississippi or Bust. Her most recent book is The Red, Black, White, the Alabama Communist Party, 1930 to 1950. It's gotten excellent reviews in The Nation and Jacobin, and I highly recommend checking it out. Mary, thank you so much for joining us on the Still Spying podcast today.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So the topic today is obviously the FBI's informant in the Ku Klux Klan, Gary Thomas Rowe. But I want to start with Viola Liuzzo. Who was she?
Well, she was the first woman who was killed in the 1960s civil rights era. I believe she was the only one, but I do know that she was the first. And the Klan had portrayed her as an outside agitator who had come to the Voting Rights March in 1965 from Detroit, that she was a Detroit housewife who had no business coming down to the march to protest. But she's actually grown up in Georgia, and she essentially was a poor white Southerner, and she knew what life was like in the South. So she was one of 25,000 volunteers who responded to Martin Luther King's national appeal to walk with him from Selma to Montgomery to support passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act that was pending in Congress. And this was important because the 1964 Civil Rights Act had not addressed voting. So the Voting Rights Act really was the completion of the Civil Rights Act of the year before. So she was one of 3 volunteers killed during that Voting Rights March. And the other 2 were Jimmy Lee Jackson, who was a young black man. He had been demonstrating in Marion, Alabama, and he was shot by state troopers and killed. And the Reverend James Reeb, who was a white Unitarian minister who came for the march but was beaten up and killed by the 2 Klansmen. So they were the other 2, and eventually their sacrifice was honored, and yet Liuzzo's was not. She was the most controversial of the 3 who were killed during that march, and in many ways that's what makes her story absolutely fascinating, why it happened.
So let's talk about her death. What happened on the night of March 25th, 1965?
Well, she had come from Detroit. She had driven herself to Selma a few days early. For those 3 days, she worked with Martin Luther King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and she registered volunteers, and she transported marchers to Montgomery back and forth, and provided first aid because she was trained in first aid. And on the last day of the march, which was March 25th, she and Leroy Morton, who was a 19-year-old black young man from Selma. He was a barber, but he had volunteered with the SCLC to work with the transportation unit, and he was partnered with Mrs. Liuzzo. So what they did was use her car to transport volunteers back and forth from Selma to Montgomery. So about 7:30 at night on March the 25th, they began their final run from Selma to Montgomery to pick up a few remaining marchers who needed a ride to the airport. Mrs. Liuzzo had planned to take Leroy back to Selma, and then she would leave from there and go home that night. But on the way to Montgomery, just as they were leaving Selma near the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were spotted by 4 white men in a red and white Impala, and these were 4 Klansmen. They saw her car, and they had been working the march all day long. They were looking for trouble. They were looking for someone of stature that they might assassinate to send a lesson to the marchers who'd come down. But security was so tight they couldn't get near people like King or officials who had come down from the north. And they were very, very frustrated. So when they spotted this white woman with a black young man sitting in the front seat of her car, and the car had Michigan plates, so it was clearly from up north. They really recognized an opportunity, not the one, that they had planned to do, but a discussion ensued, and they agreed that killing them would be a warning to blacks that no march was ever going to change the South, and it would also be a warning to white liberals and the Southerners who worked with them, that promoting revolution was life-threatening. So they were really killed for the symbolism of what their deaths would mean. So these 4 Klansmen followed Liuzzo and Morton along Highway 80, which is a highway that ran directly from Selma to Montgomery, and they began a high-speed chase. And they pulled up alongside of her Oldsmobile. Finally, they were able to, she was going about 90 miles an hour, and in those days, in 1965, this was not a straight arrow road. It was a kind of a winding road. But finally, they pulled up alongside of her and fired several handguns into her car. So she was killed instantly, and Leroy Morton, her blood splashed all over him, and he pretended to be dead when the Klansmen came back to look to see if he'd killed them both. And that's how he survived. So it was a bloody It was a cruel and a bloody death for Mrs. Liuzzo.
And what was the national reaction to this murder like?
Well, it was kind of a national flashpoint. It was all about social justice, civil rights activism, and feminism. And as I said, the two other black young man and the white minister were heroes, but there was something attached to her death that was very, very different from the way their deaths were reacted to. And the interesting thing to me was that white women seemed especially angry at this woman who had been killed. They asked why she was traveling to Selma alone, without any ties to political or religious or social institutions. She wasn't a social worker or a teacher or a lawyer, member of the clergy, or even a student activist. And there was always something kind of hanging over, questions about why she was doing this. What were her motives? And a few weeks after her murder, Ladies' Home Journal commissioned a national survey to find out how many people believed that a mother had the right to leave her family and to advocate for a social cause. Now, one of the flashpoints was that Mrs. Liuzzo had 5 children. And so many women were horrified that someone would undertake a dangerous journey with 5 children at home. So the pollsters made it clear that what they were asking was not about the issue, not about the cause, rather a mother's right to become an activist. And the results were interesting. They found that overall 55% of Americans believed that a mother did not have that right. 26% believed that she did, and full 19% had no opinion about it. In the Northeast, 51% believed that mothers did not have the right to become activists. 35% believed that they did. And in the South, 61% believed that a mother did not have the right to become an activist, and 23% believed that she did. So right from the get-go, there was something always not right about Mrs. Liuzzo and what she did.
So the reason why we're discussing her today isn't just because of her enormous sacrifice and courage in going to Selma, but one of the men in the car when she was murdered was Gary Thomas Rowe. He was an FBI informant. How did the presence of an FBI informant impact the investigation into her death?
Well, his presence in the car really made the FBI complicit in the murder, because Rowe had telephoned his handler, who was Agent Neil Shanahan, about going to Selma, and he got permission from his handler. And Rowe did nothing while the murder was going on. He did nothing to prevent it or avoid it. And afterwards, he called Shanahan and gave him the names of the others. So the FBI knew about this actually in live time while it was going on. They were advised that it was going to happen, and Rowe called right after it did happen. So because of that, J. Edgar Hoover went into a panic, and he had to do something. Because they knew who the murderers were, they were able to arrest them within a few days. And President Johnson said, what wonderful work the FBI was doing. Look how fast they were able to get these murderers. And now Hoover had to figure out how he was going to cover up Rowe being in the car. And what he did was to create a smear campaign against the victim. The focus shifted immediately to Mrs. Liuzzo and everything that Hoover could come up with that was wrong with her. He said that she was on drugs, that she was cheating on her husband, that she was having an affair with Leroy Morton, and her reputation just got worse and worse and worse, and the sympathy for her really ended.
Yeah, I know she was controversial from the start, but my understanding was that when she died, the initial reaction was first one of horror. Johnson condemns the act publicly. Her funeral in Detroit is well attended by, I believe, civil rights and also union leaders. And then this sort of dribble or tidal wave of derogatory information emerges about her, which corrodes her legacy. And you're saying that was deliberate by Hoover because of the informant in the car.
Absolutely. He had to do something to take the heat off the FBI, because once it was discovered that Rowe was working with the FBI was implicated in the murder itself.
And Rowe is also someone whose public image undergoes a shift over time. Eventually, he becomes a major source of controversy given his undeniable participation in Klan violence while on the government payroll, as well as speculation as to just how deeply he was involved in Klan atrocities. What do we know about Rowe's role in the Klan?
Well, we know that in 1961 he was involved directly in the attack on the Freedom Riders when they pulled into Birmingham. He was actually working hand in glove not only with the Klan but with the Birmingham police, who informed the Klan that they would wait 15 minutes to respond to the attack on the Freedom Riders before they came to help, and that the Klan would have 15 minutes to do whatever they wanted to these activists. So Rowe was right in there swinging in 1961. In 1963, he was implicated in the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and that was the scene of the church being bombed, and the 4 Sunday school girls died in that bombing. That same year, he was involved in the bombing of A.G. Gadsden's home in Birmingham. Now, Gadsden was a black millionaire who was a big supporter and funder of Martin Luther King, and the idea came that it would be a good idea to bomb his house, and Rowe got involved with that. In 1964, he was involved in the death of Colonel Lemuel Penn, who was a black soldier shot on his way home from Fort Benning, Georgia, to Washington, D.C. And what's interesting about that is it was the same kind of shooting that killed Liuzzo. It was following his car, getting up alongside of it and shooting right into the car, and Penn was killed. And then for the voting rights march, he was part of what was called a missionary squad sent to scout out what trouble they could cause during the voting rights march. So that's what we know of. He's placed in all of these attacks, but there may, in fact, have been more.
Yeah, I know some historians and journalists have commented on the way he would oftentimes call in and report Klan bombings to his FBI superior very shortly after they happened and very near to the scene. I think it's important to not go too far afield into speculation, but that is something that has been noted and has raised really troubling questions. I want to go back to the Freedom Rides, because that includes not just the FBI, but also local law enforcement. What was the relationship in those days between the Klan and local police?
Well, I think you have to remember that they had many shared beliefs, the Klan and the local police, and in fact, perhaps the FBI, that there was a strong will to maintain white supremacy, and they saw outside agitators as very, very dangerous to the Southern way of life, but the federal government would be involved in their state affairs. So the police and the Klan in many ways worked hand in hand, which was dangerous enough, but you had several police officers who were also members and even officers of the Klan. So there was a kind of nexus going on there that was really dangerous, that made it really dangerous to protest or to become involved in the civil rights movement, especially for Northerners, but not exclusively for Northerners. So, the example I used was, as you said, the Birmingham police giving them 15 minutes and delaying response, which was just about as involved, I think, as you can get in those days.
I know there was some incident where Rowe claims he had tipped the FBI off that the Klan was going to commit some sort of act of violence. I don't recall specifically what it was, so they can have the local police stop them, and the local police pull them over, these Klan members, because the FBI tells them to look out for them. And one of the police warns Rowe that there's an informant in his midst. Rowe, of course, was the informant, but local Alabama police tipping off the Klan that there's an FBI informant in their midst because the FBI is reporting potential acts of violence to them. That's pretty horrific, to put it mildly. And, we're seeing some sort of discussions again about the relationship between law enforcement and far-right organizations, militias, armed vigilantes, where we see, especially in Portland, claims of the police letting these armed groups or right-wing groups go in and brutalize protesters and then coming in once they leave and arresting the protesters. So unfortunately, this is history, but it also has a lot of bearing on our present.
Absolutely. And I think what needs to be looked at is the shared beliefs of these organizations, that they sort of can't help but working with each other in some ways because they want to sustain some of the same things and get rid of some of the ideas they have in common.
Yeah, and regular listeners of the Still Spying podcast will remember that Mike German, a former FBI agent, current fellow at the Brennan Center, was our very first guest, and he's recently issued a report about open racist, open membership in these far-right groups amongst local law enforcement and what we know about it. So it is, unfortunately, an issue that's still with us. So controversy over Roe really reaches its boiling point in the late 1970s when there's media scrutiny finally of his claims about what happened that night in Selma. There's, I believe, an attempt at criminal prosecution and some civil suits brought against the FBI. One of the civil suits is led by Viola Liuzzo's family. What information comes out that leads to the family and others to seek civil judgments against Roe, and what ultimately becomes of these efforts?
I'll start with the Senate Intelligence or the Church Committee testimony. And the only reason that you got all this bubbling up in 1970s and getting Roe involved is that the Watergate break-in had exposed the FBI's COINTELPRO program. So the Church Committee was given the mandate to study government operations in domestic intelligence activities. Because, here you have a history of these domestic activities going overboard. People, the best example I think I can give you is the murder of Black Panthers a couple of years earlier when the government operation, and domestic activities. So anyway, the Church Committee was a 15-month investigation, and Rowe testified before the committee. You have to remember at this time, he was in the witness protection program because he had testified against the other Klansmen in the car. And he claimed that in 1961, he reported to his handler that the Freedom Riders were in trouble before they got to Birmingham. So he gave them that information. He admitted involvement in the Freedom Riders beating and the church bombing, and he testified that he informed his handlers that violence was planned during the Voting Rights Act. So he couldn't be prosecuted for any of it because he had been given blanket immunity in 1965. The testimony was really horrifying. These were open hearings, and so much so that the Senate created a permanent select committee on intelligence to oversee both the FBI and the CIA. The next thing that happened was 3 years later when ABC's 2020 show produced a segment about the Liuzzo murder in conjunction with their coverage of the Church Committee. Now, two of the Klansmen who were in the car, colleague Leroy Wilkins and Gene Thomas, came to the show and were interviewed. They had been released after serving 7 years of a 10-year federal sentence for the murder, and they insisted that Rowe was the actual killer, and Rowe insisted that it was Wilkins. So all of them submitted to lie detector tests, and Wilkins and Thomas passed, but Rowe did not. So then there was a lot of bubbling up of, who actually did this. By the end of the year, there was an attorney general's audit in the Birmingham files, and what turned up was a record of Rowe's 2 failed polygraph tests with respect to the 16th Street Baptist Church and the firebombing of the Gaston's home. So now you've got 3 polygraphs that he has not passed. And so, as you said, his reputation begins to, the shine is off it. Also, what came out in the audit was a record of a statement that Rowe made in 1965, shortly after the murder, to 2 Birmingham policemen that he was the one who had been the triggerman. So eventually a grand jury was assembled, and these 2 Klansmen testified to the grand jury, and Rowe was indicted for the murder of Viola Liuzzo in September of 1978. And the federal government subsequently filed a motion to dismiss based on his immunity given in 1965. So he was not, that was the end of that trial. He got a job with a security firm in Atlanta. He wrote a book, Undercover with the FBI, and he worked with a made-for-TV movie about himself, starring Don Meredith. So he was not held responsible. Whether or not he was the murderer, he walked away.
And what happens with the family's civil suit?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. That was December of 1977. The family filed a $2 million claim against the federal government for negligence because the FBI knew that Tommy Rowe and the others were planning some act of violence, and yet they didn't do anything to stop it. But the government refused to negotiate the claim. So in 79, 2 years later, they filed a formal civil suit against the FBI, which came to trial in 1983, but was dismissed based on failure to prove that the FBI had been negligent. So it was a terrible situation. Initially, the judge told the family that they would be responsible for covering the government's expenses at trial, but later on that was dropped. It was a very divisive and angry situation between the FBI and the family.
And were there any other civil suits against the FBI about Rowe, or was this the only one?
Specifically about Rowe, this was the only one. There was one of the Freedom Riders, whose name escapes me, was beaten, and he filed a suit against the FBI, not specifically Rowe, and he won that suit. And that was the suit the family was banking on to, help them at their case, although it didn't turn out to be helpful at all.
So Rowe never faces accountability for his actions.
He never
Whether
did.
or not Liuzzo or not, he was definitely involved in a lot of shady things and acts of violence that he was ever held accountable for.
No, he really wasn't. Once he got that blanket immunity, they couldn't touch him.
I mean, he also monetized his involvement. He wrote a book. There was the television movie. I believe the FBI gave him a pretty impressive payday at the end. They relocated him to San Francisco and got him a job in the U.S. Marshal Service, which he couldn't even hold down because of his volatile personality and just problematic behavior. How about our friends at the Federal Bureau of Investigation? Did they ever face any meaningful accountability for any of this?
No, not that I could ever find. Well, that was the type of character that Rowe was. He was, he wanted to be important. As you say, he was volatile. He was fascinated by violence. And I don't know, does that make you a better undercover agent?
I mean, that was the big debate that came out of these revelations, was to what extent could you allow undercover agents to participate in criminal conduct or even violence? I mean, the FBI's defense was always like, informants, in order to be in these sorts of violent groups, they have to go along with some things, otherwise they out themselves. But when you start talking about murder, is participating in a murder worth keeping the identity of the informant so they can continue to inform? I mean, if the argument is they have to participate in violence because their information they're giving the FBI is so important, but then they go out and commit the violence, and the FBI does nothing, what's the use of that information? It's a very sort of perplexing claim that the FBI is making. Do you think there's any lessons from any of this for today?
That's a wonderful question. I think there were always lessons in this, but it happened a long time ago, and I don't think any of the lessons were learned. The use of undercover agents, I don't know how extensive it currently is, but, I think I can speak more to the training of agents and certainly police officers. One of the changes that we keep saying we need better training, more training. I think that it's certainly important to train people, but you can train officers continuously. What is needed really, I think, is psychological profiling. A guy like Rowe, no matter where you put him, there was going to be trouble. He had this combination of fearlessness, which is good, and this need to be important, and this, as I said, fascination with violence. That seems to me that it could have been avoided, but that's about all that I can come up with for,
Confidential human informants continues to be a continuous problem with the FBI. I know there's controversy about the relationship of the mobster Whitey Bulger, which is outside of my expertise.
Really?
I focus on their intelligence operations and domestic dissent. But since 9/11, they have really engaged in this practice of letting undercover confidential informants act as agent provocateurs, where they go into communities, particularly Muslim communities mostly, where no one is suspected of any wrongdoing. If they're asked, who's your target, they tell them the target will come to you. Much like with Rowe, they're instructed to have physical relations with people to get their trust. And in a number of these cases, they will come up with entirely fictitious terror plots, and people will agree to participate in them, sometimes because the undercover person offers them non-existent financial compensation. Many of times their targets have, pre-existing mental illness. And then the FBI swoops in and arrests these people and says, look at this big terror bust we got. And then they use that to justify more repressive policies. Donald Trump had several iterations of his Muslim ban executive order. I don't know if it was the second or third version of it, finally cited as a reason because the courts kept asking him to just, give us any reason at all. It reminds me of the Saturday Night Live parody of the Sarah Palin interviews where the person playing Katie Couric on Saturday Night Live says, can you just name one newspaper, right? That was basically the attitude the courts gave with Trump. Like, just give us any reason at all. Like, just cite a reason. And originally he would just refuse to do so. And finally, he comes out with this reason where he cites two quote unquote terror plots involving refugees. Both of those plots were not real plots. They were ones where an agent provocateur was involved. And one of them was even cited by a judge as an example of imperfect entrapment. So confidential human sources continues to be a very, very, very big problem with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I also just want to go back a little bit. You mentioned Fred Hampton, and people who are listening at home, I would like to inform them that we did an entire episode on the assassination of Fred Hampton featuring Jeffrey Haas, who was the attorney who led the lawsuit that helped uncover the FBI's role in Fred Hampton's assassination and actually knew Fred Hampton in life. And obviously that happened a long time ago, but Jeffrey's personal recollections of that night where someone came and knocked on his door and told him that Hampton was dead, and his going to the police station and interviewing the survivors is still very, very moving, however many decades later. Mary, I want to thank you for joining us. It's always such a pleasure to talk to you. I love speaking with you. It's such a fantastic wealth of knowledge you have, and an important wealth of knowledge you have. And for those of you listening at home, I want to invite you to visit us online at stillspying.org, where you can not only listen to past episodes of the podcast, you can also sign up for our email list to get information about events we're sponsoring. We recently had an event with Aaron Leonard, who wrote a book about the FBI and folk singers. This was a very interesting one. Or to visit us on social media. We're on Twitter at Still Spying and also Facebook. And thank you for listening, as always.